Hey guys, it's John. You're on the JRB Tree Climbing channel. Let's talk about foot loops. You are aware from prior videos that my preferred foot loop is this, the JRB Garda Hitch foot loop, which we've recently improved. It's got a loop for our foot. It's got a second small loop here I call the best friend that gets connected to our second short and redundant bridge. And it's got a third loop that we use to transform its size and make it shorter. This is quite a versatile item, and although you've seen it used, a lot of you are asking smart questions. In my Facebook group, we've got a little bit more time for discussion than in YouTube videos, and folks have asked me, John, what about this? What about a dedicated foot loop? In prior videos, we've seen you climb with a dedicated foot loop that's on the line already. You've seen me climb with no foot loop at all. That's possible. Why aren't you using these techniques instead? They seem simpler. Well, I'm going to explain that to you. So let's put this aside and we'll explore some of the other options. But if you needed to take away anything, take away the fact that this is my preferred foot loop. It is the most versatile. It works on both a single rope and a doubled rope, so we can use for SRT or DSRT, and we can shorten it, and we can always self-rescue off of it. See my related videos. A reminder as always to check the website, jrbtreeclimbing.com, and the video description. Before asking a question, most likely that question's answered in one of the supporting videos. Some of the other things I'm going to show you today, like here's a foot loop. It's not attached to the rope, and I have constructed it out of 6 feet of webbing. And all I do at the end is I take 1 foot of that 6 feet, I shorten it to 4 because there's a 1 foot overlap here, right? 1 foot. And I just form an overhand knot. And that makes this knot at the end, it makes it an overhand end loop. You don't need a knot tying video for that. I just created an overhand end loop and did the same thing at the other side. And with that, we've created a foot loop. So how we attach it to the line, there's a number of ways to do so. I also have with me my very first Garda Hitch foot loop. This is really short, and it's got provision for 2 feet, which is, you know, that's incidental in terms of the point. The point is that this is too small to use for redundancy. Let's get started. Now here is a system you've seen before. This was introduced as my hitch climbing system. So I don't really need to climb very high today. I'm going to stay close to the ground so you can see what's going on. Let's pop a Maverick hitch on the tree. Let's grab our Maverick pole. And let's put that on the tree. Now you've seen this system before. This was before the Longhorn Agile hitch was developed. I used the JRB Ascender hitch because it's auto-tending. Let's grab this and let's get on it. This system had an integrated foot loop, just like the one I showed you. This one was tied onto a ring. This hitch here could be a JRB Ascender, it could be a Longhorn Agile, it could be any smooth and self-tending friction hitch. But it's possible to climb like this. But ask yourself why I'm not using it. Well, it's non-redundant, right? I don't have a place to put my redundant connection. And if I were to put it here, well, that's a little too short, right? I'd never self-rescue. We don't want to be in a position where we're all jammed up. Now, sure, the foot loop could be a little bit longer, but when we're climbing in a hitch climbing method, that is the most hitch climbing or stick climbing, anytime we want to avoid using a lineman's belt and have our body really close to the tree, and we want a really short upper bridge, this is the stress case. This is the time when I can't have a foot loop that's too long and I can't have one that's too short. And so that's about the right size for my foot loop. If I had it any longer, there wouldn't be any gap here, and yet it's too short to really give me good redundancy. Now sure, I could make this bridge a little longer, but trust me, I've done a lot of climbs and I've tested self-rescue. Self-rescue with this is more problematic. The other thing about this kind of a system is when you think about the nature of redundancy, ideally, a redundancy design, your backup is a different design than your primary system because there's such a thing as common failure modes. So take, for example, here. Let's say I did have a longer foot loop. You know, I had a little longer one. Well, what if I'm not too good at tying this JRB ascender hitch? Let's say my rope was wet. Let's say it needed another wrap, but I didn't ever test in wet conditions. And this started to slip. Well, guess what? This is likely to slip too. So you'd be up there in the tree climbing and this starts to slip. And what does it do? It smacks right on top of this friction hitch and it starts to tend it down, right? So I'll simulate that. So I will simulate this upper hitch starting to slip. And now, look what's happening. If it's slipping, it can push the second one down. These have the same failure modes. And by the way, recovery was something this small. Now I'm strong enough to do it, but you might not be. And I let my bridge out to be a little longer. Trust me, it's difficult to do. Look what I have here. I took my hitch climbing system and I built the same thing, but this time I've got a JRB cinch on this one. Let's put this on the tree. I'm not going to advance it up. Right, we get to choose our anchor. We can use the Maverick hitch, which is up above, and advance it with a pole. We can use a JRB cinch and advance it with a pole. We have options for the friction hitch. You saw prior content and that prior demonstration with the JRB Ascender, but it's more complicated to tie than the Longhorn Agile, which has got great performance. It's just a little bigger. But what do I have further down on this rope? Well, I have another compact Longhorn Agile and another foot loop, just like the one you saw. Of course, I can climb on this. It's the same thing as what you just saw. I'm only going to climb a foot here. So incidentally, if you are going to tie this kind of a system, and you're considering the JRB Ascender versus the Longhorn Agile, well, the Longhorn Agile is easier to put on and take off the rope. The JRB Ascender has slightly better performance in its auto tending ability, but it's a lot more to take on and take off of the rope. Well, you might ask, well, I'm going to leave it on the rope all the time. Well, it's not that simple. You've got to also think about how much rope you're using. If I want to leave all of this on the rope and climb in an SRT configuration, not hitch climbing, but SRT, well, I need enough rope to do so, because suffice it to say that the action of rigging that up in the tree, unless I can pass this stuff through a Scott's Lock bowline, and you've seen me do that, which isn't guaranteed, or unless I'm going to use a basal anchor and use a lot of rope. In SRT, we typically put our stuff on at the climb site. And as you know, in a hunting situation, I'm not a fan of doing that. I want to avoid tying knots if I can do so. So please think that through. If you're considering this kind of system, think it through. Am I building an SRT only system? Am I building a hitch climbing system only, a stick climbing system only? And do I need to take it off of the rope? Okay, so let's take this double-sided JRB cinch system. We've done a lot of work on the JRB cinch recently. Take a look at the playlist. This is a double-sided JRB cinch system. This is the Maverick pole. The design for this is on the channel, on the website, and you can purchase your Maverick pole at 8 Canyon Outfitters in the JRB collection. So I'm going to only do this once. It doesn't matter if we're using a foot loop that's too short for redundancy, or if we're using a Garda Hitch that's too short for redundancy. Let's just show you a failure mode and how we might recover from it. And for this, we'll be borrowing some tools from our toolbox. So let's just go up a tiny bit. So I'm in the middle of a climb, and my friction hitch starts to slip, and I don't have redundancy. So I've got a Garda hitch or I've got a short foot loop, but this starts to slip, and you're literally stuck on one foot. Well, I mean, you're stuck. I mean, how long can you stay in this position? Not very long. And so this is the main reason that I advise that we use the Garda hitch, where we can self-recover. But back to the tools in your toolbox, I gave you a tool we call the one-handed head-and knot, and it requires a Prusik loop. So I've got a Prusik loop here. I'm standing on one foot. If you can get this out of your bag, you can tie it with one hand. This is an emergency situation, right? Emergency situation. I'm going to take my swivel carabiner on my bridge because it's there. And look, I've recovered. I've recovered. That's a real world situation for the one-handed head-and knot, because I realize some of you are out there and you're using short Garda hitch foot loops, and you're using short foot loops like this, which questionably can be used in a redundancy situation. I want you to be aware of that trick with the one-handed headed. And so once that's in place, I can, whatever was going wrong with this friction hitch, I could fix it. I could retie it. But my priority at this stage should be getting to the ground. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the exercise, but I could take that and retie it and transfer it onto it. But because my priority should be getting to the ground, we would be more likely to just transition into rappel. And I'll show you how to do that, because remember, the head-end's not breakable under load. It's not breakable under load. So let's just go up a couple more feet so I can show you how I would get off of this. These are kind of advanced techniques, and I'd rather you didn't have to think about them. But I don't often take the time to explain all of this in my other videos. So we're kind of answering the question why here. We're answering that question. So I put on my munter. Okay. Now, I can't break this. How do I get out of this situation? Well, if you're strong enough, you can simply stand on the loop temporarily. You can stand on the loop, push this up, and push it down to break it. But if you're not strong enough to do that, you can take that Garda that you were just using, or the short foot loop that's further down on the line, and you can use it temporarily. So I'm only going to stand on it long enough so I can relieve my weight from here. I can break this head-and knot, which is unbreakable. I can come back down and careful, exerting force with my left tricep. See, I'm kind of jammed up there. It's kind of a short foot loop. This is in rappel mode. Now I'll remove the Garda. But this is hard to do. What if your fingers were cold? What if, this happened at, as it's dark at the end of a long hunt? I'd rather you didn't need to worry about this stuff. I'd rather you simply had a Garda Hitch foot loop. Okay, now, and the reason I'm wearing a Longhorn loop was to remind me that, in terms of tying the head-in with a Prusik loop, I don't tend to carry Prusik loops anymore. I carry a Longhorn loop. Well, we can form a head-in with the Longhorn loop as well. Just a little bit more bulk to pass through. Okay, so you don't need a Prusik if you've got a Longhorn loop. Okay guys, so just the reason the sun's a little higher in the sky is because I just attempted a climb with no foot loop, and I'd never tried that before, a hitch climb with no foot loop. And I'm not saying it was impossible, but I sure wouldn't ever want to try it. I gave up before I got very high at all. And so you can climb without a foot loop, but I'm just not going to recommend it. Just not going to recommend it. If you forget your Garda, you can always improvise, right? You can always improvise on the scene. If you've got one of these on your person, whether it was for self-rescue purposes or anything, you can always construct a foot loop. So let's see if I can do that. So I just tied a compact Longhorn Agile. Okay, I tossed it aside, but here's that foot loop I just created earlier. You've always got a spare carabiner. You might only have, let's say, your deer drag, but if you've got any kind of cordage or piece of webbing and you can make something about this long, well, you've got yourself a foot loop, and you can climb. You won't have redundancy, but the Longhorn in self-tending mode, this one's compact, is, a usable and crude small foot loop. But again, in conclusion, the Garda Hitch is the way to go. You won't make a better investment in climbing efficiency, versatility, and safety than the Garda Hitch foot loop. Goes on easy, works with one rope or two ropes. I can run it long, and the transformation mode is basically the shortest we can run it and still self-rescue. All right, guys, thank you very much.